Hello. Okay, I'm picking up where I left off. That's on page 50 at Andros Promotes the First American Revolution. I'm looking at how long the rest of this chapter is. Oh, it's less pages than I expected. All right. Okay. Andros Promotes the First American Revolution. Massachusetts suffered further humiliation in 1686 when the Dominion of New England was created by the royal authority. Unlike the homegrown New England Confederation, it was imposed from London. Embracing at first all of New England, it was expanded 2 years later to include New York and East and West Jersey. The Dominion also aimed at bolstering colonial defense in the event of war with the Indians, and hence, from the imperial viewpoint of the Parliament, was a statesmanlike move. More importantly, the Dominion of New England was designed to promote urgently needed efficiency in the administration of the English navigation laws. Those laws reflected the intensifying colonial rivalries of the 17th century. They sought to stitch England's overseas possessions more tightly to the motherland by throttling American trade with countries not ruled by the English crown. Like colonial peoples everywhere, the Americans chafed at such confinements, and smuggling became an increasingly common and honorable occupation. At the head of the new dominion stood autocratic Sir Edmund Andros, an able English military man, conscientious but tactless. Establishing English headquarters in puritanical Boston, he generated much hostility by his open affiliation with the despised Church of England. The colonists were also outraged by his noisy and Sabbath-profaning soldiers, who were accused of teaching the people to drink, blaspheme, curse, and damn. Andros was prompt to use the mailed fist. He ruthlessly curbed and cherished town meetings, laid heavy restriction on the courts, the press, and the schools, and revoked all land titles. Dispensing with the popular assemblies, he taxed the people without the consent of their duly elected representatives. He also strove to enforce the unpopular navigation laws and suppress smuggling. Liberty-loving colonists, accustomed to unusual privileges during the long decades of neglect, were goaded to the verge of revolt. Oh, I just burped. Oh, okay. Anyway, the people of Old England soon taught the people of New England a few lessons in resisting oppression. In 1688 to 1689, the English engineered the memorable Glorious, or Bloodless, Revolution. Dethroning the despotic and unpopular Catholic James II, they enthroned the Protestant rulers of the Netherlands, the Dutch-born William III, and his English wife, Mary II, daughter of James II. When the news of the Glorious Revolution reached America, the ramshackle dominion of New England collapsed like a house of cards. A Boston mob, catching the fever, rose against the existing regime. Sir Edmund Andros attempted to flee in women's clothing, but was betrayed by boots protruding beneath his dress. He was hastily shipped off to England. Massachusetts, though rid of the despotic Andros, did not gain as much from the upheaval as it had hoped. In 1691, it was arbitrarily made a royal colony with a new charter and a new royal governor. The permanent loss of the ancient charter was a staggering blow to the proud Puritans, who never fully recovered. Worst of all, the privilege of voting, once a monopoly of church members, was now to be enjoyed by all qualified male property holders. England's glorious revolution reverberated throughout the colonies from New England to the Chesapeake. Inspired by the challenge to the crown in Old England, many colonists seized the occasion to strike against royal authority in America. Unrest rocked both New York and Maryland from 1689 to 1691 until newly appointed royal governors restored a semblance of order. Most importantly, the new monarchs relaxed the royal grip on colonial trade, inaugurating a period of solitary neglect, when the much resented navigation laws were only weakly enforced. Yet residues remained of Charles II's effort to assert tighter administrative control over his empire. More English officials, judges, clerks, customs officials, now staffed the courts and strolled the wharves of English America. Many were incompetent, corrupt hacks who knew little and cared less about American affairs. Appointed by influential patrons in far-off England, they blocked the rise of local leaders to positions of political power by their very presence. Aggrieved Americans reviewed them with mounting contempt and resentment as the 18th century wore on. Old Netherlanders at New Netherland. Late in the 16th century, the oppressed people of the Netherlands unfurled the standard of rebellion against Catholic Spain. After bloody and protracted fighting, they finally succeeded, with the aid of Protestant England, in winning their independence. The 17th century, the era of Rembrandt and other famous artists, was a golden age in Dutch history. This vigorous little lowland nation finally emerged as a major commercial and naval power, and then it ungratefully challenged the supremacy of its former benefactor, England. 3 great Anglo-Dutch naval wars were fought in the 17th century, with as many as 100 ships on each side. The sturdy Dutch dealt blows about as heavy as they received. The Dutch Republic also became a leading colonial power, with by far its greatest activity in the East Indies. There, it maintained an enormous and profitable empire for over 300 years. The Dutch East India Company was virtually a state within a state, and at one time supported an army of 10,000 men and a fleet of 190 ships, 40 of them men of war. Seeking greater riches, this enterprising company employed an English explorer, Henry Hudson. Disregarding orders to sail northeast, he ventured into Delaware Bay and New York Bay in 1609, and then ascended the Hudson River, hoping that at last he had chanced upon the coveted shortcut through the continent. But, as the event proved, he merely filed a Dutch claim to a magnificently wooded and watered area. Much less powerful than the mighty Dutch East India Company was the Dutch West India Company, which maintained profitable enterprises in the Caribbean. At times it was less interested in trading than in raiding, and at one fell swoop in 1628 captured a fleet of Spanish treasure ships laden with loot worth $15 million. The company also established outposts in Africa and a thriving sugar industry in Brazil, which for several decades was its principal center of activity in the New World. New Netherland, in the beautiful Hudson River area, was planted in 1623 to 1624 on a permanent basis. Established by the Dutch West India Company for its quick-profit fur trade, it was never more than a secondary interest of the founders. The company's most brilliant stroke was to buy Manhattan Island from the Indians, who did not actually own it, for virtually worthless trinkets, 22,000 acres of what is now perhaps the most valuable real estate in the world, for pennies per acre. New Amsterdam, later New York City, was a company town. It was run by and for the Dutch company, in the interest of the stockholders. The investors had no enthusiasm for religious toleration, free speech, or democratic practices, and the governors appointed by the company as directors general were usually harsh and despotic. Religious dissenters who opposed the official Dutch Reformed Church were regarded with suspicion, and for a while Quakers were savagely abused. In response to repeated protests by the aggravated colonists, a local body with limited lawmaking power was finally established. This picturesque Dutch colony took on a strongly aristocratic tint and retained it for generations. Vast feudal estates fronting the Hudson River, known as patroonships, were granted to promoters who agreed to settle 50 people on them. One patroonship in the Albany area was slightly larger than the later state of Rhode Island. Colorful little New Amsterdam attracted a cosmopolitan population, as is common in seaport towns. 23 Jews arrived in 1654, refugees from religious persecution in Catholic Brazil, a harbinger of the city's later reputation as a haven for the homeless and the harried. A French Jesuit missionary visiting in the 1640s noted that 18 different languages were being spoken in the streets. New York's later babel of immigrant tongues was thus foreshadowed. Friction with the English and Swedish neighbors. Vexations beset the Dutch company colony from the beginning. The directors general were largely incompetent. Company shareholders demanded their dividends, even at the expense of the colony's welfare. The Indians, infuriated by Dutch cruelties, retaliated with horrible massacres. As a defense measure, the hard-pressured settlers on Manhattan Island erected a stout wall, from which Wall Street derives its name. New England was hostile to the growth of its Dutch neighbor, and the people of Connecticut finally ejected intruding Hollanders from their verdant valley. The Swedes also trespassed on Dutch preserves from 1638 to 1655 by planting the anemic colony of New Sweden on the Delaware River. This was the golden age of Sweden, during and following the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648, in which its brilliant king Gustavus Adolphus had carried the torch of Protestantism. This outburst of energy in Sweden caused it to enter the costly colonial game in America, though on something of a shoestring. Resenting the Swedish intrusion on the Delaware, the Dutch dispatched a small military expedition in 1655. It was led by the ablest of the directors general, Peter Stuyvesant, who had lost a leg while soldiering in the West Indies and was dubbed Father Wooden Leg by the Indians. The main fort fell after a bloodless siege, whereupon Swedish rule came to an abrupt end. The colonists were absorbed by New Netherland. New Sweden, never important, soon faded away, leaving behind in a later Delaware a sprinkling of Swedish place names and Swedish log cabins, the first in America, as well as an admixture of Swedish blood. Dutch residues in New York. Lacking vitality, and representing only a secondary commercial interest of the Dutch, New Netherland lay under the menacing shadow of the vigorous English colonies to the north. In addition, it was honeycombed with New England immigrants. Numbering about one half of the New Netherlands' 10,000 souls in 1664, they might in time have seized control from within. The days of the Dutch on the Hudson were numbered, for the English regarded them as intruders. In 1664, after the imperially ambitious Charles II had granted the area to his brother, the Duke of York, a strong English squadron appeared off the decrepit defenses of New Amsterdam. A fuming Peter Stuyvesant, short of all munitions except courage, was forced to surrender without firing a shot. New Amsterdam was thereupon renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York. England won a splendid harbor, strategically located in the middle of the mainland colonies, and the stately Hudson River penetrating the interior. With the removal of this foreign wedge, the English barrier now waved triumphantly over the solid stretch of territory from Maine to the Carolinas. The conquered Dutch province tenaciously retained many of the illiberal features of earlier days. An autocratic spirit survived, and the aristocratic element gained strength when certain corrupt English governors granted immense acreage to their favorites. Influential landowning families, such as the Livingstons and the Delanceys, wielded disproportionate power in the affairs of colonial New York. These monopolistic land policies, combined with the lordly atmosphere, discouraged many European immigrants from coming. The physical growth of New York was correspondingly retarded. I dislike that. The Dutch peppered place names over the land, including Harlem, Brooklyn, and Hellgate. They likewise left their imprint on the gambrel-footed architecture. As for social customs and folkways, no other foreign group of comparable size had made so colorful a contribution. Noteworthy are Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf, a dangerous game played with heavy clubs and forbidden in settled areas. Penn's holy experiment in Pennsylvania. A remarkable group of dissenters, commonly known as Quakers, arose in England during the mid-1600s. Their name derived from the report that they quaked when under deep religious emotion. Officially, they were known as the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers were especially offensive to the authorities, both religious and civil. They refused to support the established Church of England with taxes. They built simple meeting houses, congregated without a paid clergy, and spoke up themselves in meetings when moved. Believing that they were all children in the sight of God, they kept their broad-brimmed hats on in the presence of their betters, and addressed others with the simple thees and thous rather than conventional titles. They would take no oaths because Jesus had commanded, "Swear not at all." This was peculiar. Often embroiled them with government officials for test oaths. Were still required to establish the fact that a person was not a Roman Catholic. The Quakers, beyond a doubt, were a people of deep conviction. They abhorred strife and warfare and refused military service. As advocates of passive resistance, they would turn the other cheek and rebuild their meeting house on the site where their enemies had torn it down. Their courage and devotion to principle finally triumphed. Although at times they seemed stubborn and unreasonable, they were a simple, devoted, democratic people, contending in their own high-minded way for religious and civic freedom. William Penn, a well-born and athletic young Englishman, was attracted to the Quaker faith in 1660, when only 16 years old. His father, disapproving, administered a sound flogging. After various adventures in the army, the best portrait of the peaceful Quaker has him in armor, the youth firmly embraced the despised faith and suffered much persecution. The courts branded him a saucy and impertinent fellow. Several hundred of his less fortunate fellow Quakers died of cruel treatment, and thousands more were fined, flogged, or cast into dank prisons. Penn's thoughts naturally turned to the New World, where a sprinkling of Quakers had already fled, notably to Rhode Island, North Carolina, and New Jersey. Eager to establish an asylum for his people, he also hoped to experiment with liberal ideas in government and at the same time make a profit. Finally, in 1681, he managed to secure from the king an immense grant of fertile land, in consideration of a monetary debt owed to his deceased father by the crown. The king called the area Pennsylvania, Penn's Woodland, in honor of the sire. The modest son, fearing that critics would accuse him of naming it after himself, sought unsuccessfully to change the name. Pennsylvania was by far the best advertised of all the colonies. Its founder, the first American advertising man, sent out paid agents and distributed countless pamphlets printed in English, Dutch, French, and German. Unlike the lures of many other American real estate promoters, then and later, Penn's inducements were generally truthful. He especially welcomed forward-looking spirits and substantial citizens, including the industrious carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and other manual workers. His liberal land policy, which encouraged substantial holdings, was instrumental in attracting a heavy inflow of immigrants. Quaker Pennsylvania and its neighbors. Penn formally launched his colony in 1681. His task was simplified by the presence of several thousand squatters, Dutch, Swedish, English, Welsh, who were already scattered along the banks of the Delaware River. Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love in Greek, was more carefully planned than most colonial cities and consequently enjoyed wide and attractive streets. Penn farsightedly bought land from the Indians, including Chief Tammany, the later patron saint of New York's political Tammany Hall. His treatment of the native peoples was so fair that the Quaker broadbrims went among them unarmed and even employed them as babysitters. For a brief period, Pennsylvania seemed the promised land of amicable Indian-white relations. Some southern tribes even migrated to Pennsylvania, seeking the Quaker haven. But, ironically, Quaker tolerance proved the undoing of Quaker Indian policy. As non-Quaker European immigrants flooded into the province, they undermined the Quakers' own benevolent policy towards the Indians. The feisty Scots-Irish were particularly unpersuaded by Quaker idealism. Penn's new propriety regime was unusually liberal and included a representative assembly elected by the landowners. No tax-supported state church drained coffers or demanded allegiance. Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all residents, although Penn, under pressure from London, was forced to deny Catholics and Jews the privilege of voting or holding office. The death penalty was imposed only for treason and murder, as compared with some 200 capital crimes in England. Among other noteworthy features, no provision was made by the peace-loving Quakers of Pennsylvania for a military defense. No restrictions were placed on immigration, and naturalization was made easy. The humane Quakers early developed a strong dislike of black slavery, and in the genial glow of Pennsylvania, some progress was made toward social reform. With its many liberal features, Pennsylvania attracted a rich mix of ethnic groups. They included numerous religious misfits who were repelled by the harsh practices of neighboring colonies. This Quaker refuge boasted a surprisingly modern atmosphere in an unmodern age, and to an unusual degree afforded economic opportunity, civil liberty, and religious freedom. Even so, blue laws prohibited ungodly revelers, stage plays, playing cards, dice, games, and excessive hilarity. Under such generally happy auspices, Penn's brainchild grew lustily. The Quakers were shrewd business people, and in a short time the settlers were exporting grain and other foodstuffs. Within 2 years, Philadelphia claimed 300 houses and 2,500 people. Within 19 years, by 1700, the colony was surpassed in population and wealth only by long-established Virginia and Massachusetts. William Penn, who altogether spent about 4 years in Pennsylvania, was never fully appreciated by his colonists. His governors, some of them incompetent and tactless, quarreled bitterly with the people, who were constantly demanding greater political control. Penn himself became too friendly with James II, the deposed Catholic king. Thrice arrested for treason, thrust for a time into a debtor's prison, and afflicted by a paralytic stroke, he died full of sorrows. His enduring moment was not only a noble experiment in government, but also a new commonwealth. Based on civil and religious liberty and dedicated to a freedom of conscience and worship, it held aloft a hopeful torch in a world of semi-darkness. Small Quaker settlements flourished next door to Pennsylvania. New Jersey was started in 1664 when 2 noble proprietors received the area from the Duke of York. A substantial number of New Englanders, including many whose weary soil had petered out, flocked to the new colony. One of the proprietors sold West New Jersey in 1674 to a group of Quakers, who here set up a sanctuary even before Pennsylvania was launched. East New Jersey was also acquired in later years by the Quakers, whose wings were clipped in 1702 when the Crown combined the 2 Jerseys in a royal colony. Swedish Tin's Delaware consisted of only 3 counties, 2 at high tide, the witticism goes, and was named after Lord de la Warr, the harsh military governor who had arrived in Virginia in 1610. Harboring some Quakers and closely associated with Penn's prosperous colony, Delaware was granted its own assembly in 1703, but until the American Revolution, it remained under the governor of Pennsylvania. The middle way in the Middle Colonies. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, enjoyed certain features in common. In general, the soil was fertile and the expanse of land was broad, unlike rock-bestrewn New England. Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey came to be known as the bread colonies, by virtue of their heavy exports of grain. Rivers also played a vital role. Broad, languid streams, notably the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson, tapped the fur trade of the interior and beckoned adventuresome spirits into the back country. The rivers had few cascading waterfalls, unlike New England's, and hence presented little inducement to milling or manufacturing with water wheel power. A surprising amount of industry nonetheless hummed in the middle colonies. Virginal forest abounded for lumbering and shipbuilding. The presence of deep river estuaries and landlocked harbors stimulated both commerce and the growth of seaports, such as New York and Philadelphia. Even Albany, more than 100 miles up the Hudson, was a port of some consequence in colonial days. The middle colonies were in many respects midway between New England and the southern plantation group. Except in aristocratic New York, the landholdings were generally intermediate in size, smaller than the plantation South, but larger than in small farm New England. Local government lay somewhere between the personalized town meeting of New England and the diffused county government of the South. There were fewer industries in the middle colonies than in New England, more than in the South. Yet the middle colonies, which in some ways were the most American part of America, could claim certain distinctions in their own right. Generally speaking, the population was more ethnically mixed than that of other settlements. The people were blessed with an unusual degree of religious toleration and democratic control. Earnest and devout Quakers, in particular, made a compassionate contribution to human freedom out of all proportion to their numbers. Desirable land was more easily acquired in the middle colonies than in New England or in the tidewater South. One result was that a considerable amount of economic and social democracy prevailed, though less so in aristocratic New York. Modern-minded Benjamin Franklin, often regarded as the most representative American personality of his era, was a child of the middle colonies. Although it is true that Franklin was born a Yankee in puritanical Boston, he entered Philadelphia as a 17-year-old in 1720 with a loaf of bread under each arm and immediately found a congenial home in the urbane, open atmosphere of what was then North America's biggest city. One Pennsylvanian later boasted that Franklin came to life at 17 in Philadelphia. By the time Franklin arrived in the city of brotherly love, the American colonies were themselves coming to life. Population was growing robustly. Transportation and communication were gradually improving. The British, for the most part, continued their hands-off policies, leaving the colonists to fashion their own local governments, run their own churches, and develop networks of intercolonial trade. As people and products crisscrossed the colonies with increasing frequency and an increasing volume, Americans began to realize that, far removed from Mother England, they were not merely surviving, but truly thriving. Okay, there's a couple little thingies here. Examining the evidence, a 17th century valuables cabinet. In 1999, a boatyard worker on Cape Cod and his sister, a New Hampshire teacher, inherited a small chest that had always stood on their grandmother's hall table, known in the family as the Franklin chest. Eager to learn more about it, they set out to discover the original owner, tracing their family genealogy and consulting with furniture experts. In January 2000, this rare 17th century cabinet, its full provenance now known, appeared on the auction block and sold for a record $2.4 million to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. No less extraordinary than the price was the history of its creator and its owners embodied in the piece. Salem cabinetmaker James Simmons had made the chest for his relatives Joseph Pope and Bathsheba Folger to commemorate their 1679 marriage. Simmons carved the Pope's initials and the date on the door of the cabinet. He also put elaborate S-curves on the sides, remarkably similar to the Mannerist carved oak paneling produced in Norfolk, England, from which his own cabinetmaker father had emigrated. Behind the chest doors are 10 drawers where the popes would have kept jewelry, money, deeds, and writing materials. Surely they prized the chest as a sign of refinement to be shown off in their best room, a sentiment passed down through the next 13 generations, even as the popes' identities were lost. The chest may have become known as the Franklin chest because Bathsheba was Benjamin Franklin's aunt, but also because that identification appealed more to descendants ashamed that the Quaker popes, whose own parents had been persecuted for their faith, were virulent accusers during the Salem witch trials of 1692. Okay, varying viewpoints, Europeanizing America or Americanizing Europe. The history of discovery and colonization raises perhaps the most fundamental question about all American history. Should it be understood as the extension of European civilization into the two continents of the New World, or as the gradual development of uniquely American cultures? An older school of thought tended to emphasize that Europeanization of America. Historians of that persuasion paid close attention to the situation in Europe, particularly England and Spain in the 15th and 16th centuries. They also focused on the exportation of the values and institutions of the mother countries to the new lands in the Western Sea. Although some historians also examined the transforming effect of America on Europe, this approach, too, remained essentially Eurocentric. More recently, historians have concentrated on the distinctiveness of America. The concern with European origins has evolved into a comparative treatment of European settlements in the New World. England, Spain, Holland, and France now attract more attention for the divergent kinds of societies they fostered in America than for the way they commonly pursued old world ambitions in the new. The newest trend to emerge is a transatlantic history that views European empires and their American colonies as part of a process of cultural cross-fertilization affecting not only the colonies, but Europe and Africa as well. This less Eurocentric approach has also changed the way historians explain the colonial development of America. Rather than telling the story of colonization as the imposition of European ways of life through discovery and conquest, historians increasingly view the colonial period as one of contact and adaptation between European, African, and Native American ways of life. Scholars, including Richard White, Alfred Crosby, William Cronin, Karen Kupperman, and Timothy Silver, have enhanced understanding of the cultural as well as the physical transformations that resulted from contact. An environment of forest and meadows, for example, gave way to a landscape of fields and fences as Europeans sought to replace the agricultural villages they had known in Europe. Aggressive deforestation even produced climate changes, as treeless tracts made for colder winters, hotter summers, and earth-gouging floods. Raymond Gutierrez's When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away has expanded the colonial stage to include interactions between Spanish settlers and Native Americans in the Southwest. J.H. Eliot's magisterial work, Empires of the Atlantic World, 2006, makes brilliant use of the comparative approach to illuminate the worlds of the British and Spanish empires. Spain had a grand imperial plan that it pursued with notable consistency: exclude Jews and Moors from its domains, convert the native peoples to Catholicism, follow military conquest with military rule, and eventually defer to colonial elites for the orderly administration of its possessions. Britain had no comparably systematic plan. It showed relatively little interest in converting the Indians, tolerated all kinds of immigrants to its colonies, long left them alone to cultivate institutions of self-government and representative democracy, and when it eventually tried to tighten its imperial grip, pressured local elites into open revolt. The two empires left consequential and contrasting legacies of political stability in the United States and chronic political turmoil in Latin America. As one reviewer summarized the argument, George Washington could draw on an inherited political culture, whereas the great Latin American liberator Simón Bolívar had to invent one. The variety of American societies that emerged out of the interactions of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans is now well appreciated. Early histories by esteemed historians like Perry Miller exaggerated the extent to which the New England Puritan experience defined the essence of America. Not only did these historians overlook non-English experiences, but they failed to recognize the diversity in motives, methods, and consequences that existed even within English colonization. The numbers alone tell an interesting story. By 1700, about 220,000 English colonists had immigrated to the Caribbean, but about 120,000 to the southern mainland colonies, and only about 40,000 to the Middle Atlantic and New England colonies. Although by the mid-18th century, those headed for the latter destination would account for more than half of the total. Studies such as Richard S. Dunn's Sugar and Slaves emphasize the importance of the Caribbean in early English colonization, efforts to make clear that the desire for economic gain, more than the quest for religious freedom, fueled the migration to the Caribbean islands. Similarly, Edmund S. Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, stresses the role of economic ambition in explaining the English peopling of the Chesapeake and the eventual importation of enslaved Africans to that region. Studies by Bernard Bailyn and David Hackett Fisher demonstrate that there was a scarcely atypical English migrant to the New World. English colonists migrated both singly and in families, and for economic, social, and political and religious reasons. Recent studies have also paid more attention to the conflicts that emerged out of this diversity in settler populations and colonial societies. This perspective emphasizes that the contest for economic and political supremacy within the colonies, such as the efforts of the Massachusetts Bay elite to ward off the challenges of religious heretics and the pressures that an increasingly restless lower class put on wealthy merchants and large landowners. Nowhere was internal conflict so prevalent as in the ethnically diverse middle colonies, where factional antagonisms became the defining feature of public life. The picture of British colonial North America that is emerging from all this new scholarship is of a society, unique and diverse from inception. No longer simply Europe transplanted, British America by 1700 is now viewed as an outgrowth of many intertwining roots, of different European and African heritages, of varied encounters with native peoples and a wilderness environment, and of complicated mixtures of settler populations, each with its own distinctive set of ambitions. Whew! Alright. That was to page 60 because it went off a little bit on the end. But yay!